Hello everybody. This lecture is currently about the last chapter of the book we will be covering and is on new media, cyberculture, and public discourse. This is a mouthful and overlaps with a number of topics we have discussed at length already, including the news. This chapter replaces the previous chapter of older versions of this book which discussed high school textbooks. This change is probably an improvement, but as it is new, I have already been discussing new media throughout the semester. Also, I like to allow my students to save as much money as possible. So for a year or two, some students will have read this chapter, and others will have read the chapter on textbooks. For that reason, when taking the final, be very careful to follow the instructions. I will have to find some way to incorporate both chapters during an overlap period so that students can continue to buy the cheapest possible books. Another issue is that this chapter is a bit of a hodgepodge of odds and ends about new media and isn't heavily focused. It largely teaches by way of example. I cannot go through all of these cases detailed in the book, so please make sure to read the chapter carefully. While I will not go through all of the details here, the book begins with an excellent montage through history describing how even most well-known people, not so long ago, could only talk to a very small percentage of the population. With great time and reflection, and with planning, one might directly talk to a few hundred people. Now, by whipping out one's cell phone, one can potentially speak to millions without needing to coordinate with broadcasters. Of course, most of us, even if we have a YouTube page or Instagram or Twitter account, do not have millions of followers. But a thought which resonates can take up a life of its own and get passed along virally, even if we are not celebrities. The Women's March was not started by a celebrity, but rather by a woman in her 60s named Rebecca Shook, and it led to, regardless of what side one sympathizes with, what was the largest protest in U.S. history, with over 3 million participants. There are currently more cell phones in the world than people, and there are currently more people than ever before. The book also rightly points out that people have a tendency to either elevate or deprecate this new form of communication. The internet is often either described as a great force for democracy or a cesspool that appeals to the lowest common denominator of our worst instincts. And the book is right in pointing out that there is truth to both claims. Not only are there many different aspects to new media, but how true either claim is depends upon what content one is discussing. There are some groups of people who decry anything new as a decline in civilization. They will lament emojis and abbreviations, to take just one example, as a spiral into illiteracy, while there are other more optimistic types who tend to think that the new is good because it's, well, new. Television was attacked in this way, and so was the radio. Even the printing press was criticized when it arrived on the scene. Trithimus, for example, felt that the printing press would make monks indolent, and felt that the repetitive writing required in order to make copies of text was important. Neither view is completely accurate, though perhaps history does show a progression on average. People are progressively more educated, and in spite of all the millennial bashing, millennials seem to read more than previous generations and currently use the library more than any other generation. But I digress. The point is that few things are inherently good or bad. The mass communication that the internet makes possible has both upsides and downsides, but it's difficult to deny that there are probably more upsides than downs, as we would all be hard-pressed to argue that a country would be at a competitive advantage if they eradicated the internet. Indeed, those countries that try to suppress such access to their people are often criticized for being socially repressive and are usually technologically and economically disadvantaged comparatively. Another thing that the book notes is that we are living in an era now where the authors say our communication technologies are constantly changing, which means that our norms of discourse are constantly changing. This was not always the case. Like all technology, communications technology is progressing exponentially faster. Changes in communication used to not happen once in many generations. Then, maybe every couple generations. Then every generation. Now every few years we have newer and faster ways to communicate. Maybe someday lecturers such as myself will just be able to think data into your head. Until then, alas, you have to deal with this lecture. The book's chapter is largely filled with examples of such change. In the 60s, the debates between Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley were conducted by opponents who spent months preparing and evaluating each other's arguments in preparation for a few minutes on television. Now political opponents lunge and riposte with each other over Twitter, responding to each other within minutes or hours. The book gives an example of the clash between Clinton and Bush over Twitter in 2015, and we all know how much things escalated by the 2016 election, which resulted in the Trump presidency, even as President Trump uses Twitter daily. Not only did information fly fast and furious, there were quite deliberate barrages of false information spread via forums and mediums such as Facebook, which became every bit as important, maybe even more important, than major news outlets such as CNN or the New York Times. As noted, this chapter is largely about giving examples of such change. For example, it notes that when Marshawn Lynch retired from football, he did so by tweeting, while Jim Brown in 1966 did so with a 2-page private letter to the owner of the Browns. The text says that what once required half an hour or many pages is now communicated within 140 characters. Indeed, under Trump's presidency, many advisors seem to get their news from the president's tweets rather than through official channels, though we might expect that this will change with new administrations. Still, there is something important going on with this kind of instantaneous communication. Attention span. With changing media, attention span has apparently been dropping. The book cites a 2015 study which showed that since 2000, attention spans dropped by a third, from 12 seconds to 8 seconds. A goldfish apparently has an attention span of 9 seconds. There is a sort of feedback loop here. The book claims that short attention span both results from and demands shorter bursts of attention. The book also points out that this is not necessarily a bad thing, as we are able to take in more content from more sources in a shorter time, but we should, at the same time, worry that we are collectively losing some important nuance and details about what we receive. Perhaps the most important negative that the book points out is that, at the very least, we must rely more heavily on authorities and trust our information sources to a greater degree. This is problematic since there are many untrustworthy information sources out there. And this is a really important point. Less content and less evaluation time means that we are accepting or rejecting information much more quickly. This is perhaps made worse by the fact that people are putting themselves in what might be called echo chambers, where they first only deliberately subscribe to information that affirms what they are already predisposed to believe. And second, even when we think about the fact that we are being exposed to more people, such as with Facebook or YouTube, there are algorithms in play which pick and choose the content we see based upon what we view and like, again creating echo chambers that repeat our own thoughts to us. Advice. Regardless of what side you favor about any topic, spend 3 times as long thinking deeply and fairly about the position you disagree with. The more strongly you disagree with it, the more carefully you should consider contrary information. That is to say, work to try to deliberately counter both this echo chamber effect and the psychological impediments to cogent reasoning that we have already discussed in this course, such as confirmation bias and so forth. Another issue is commentary. There are studies that seem to show that comments under videos and news articles are as persuasive to people as the articles and videos themselves. This should concern us for a couple of reasons. First, this is a concern because commenters often have no expertise in the subject matter, and any personal stories they relate are unverified. Second, while the authors of news stories, if they are from a reputable organization, put their reputations on the line, people make comments underneath such articles casually. They often simply say what they believe is true or feel in their gut is true, or even what they know isn't true simply in order to get a rise from people. Of course, the good news is that it is now easier than ever to fact-check a story. If you are reading something online, you are already connected to the web. Just hit Control-T for a new tab, enter search into Google, and quite often one can verify both data and context. But this requires viewers to be more active in their search for truth. If I were to make a second recommendation, it would be to fact check on a regular basis, even data for stories you agree with. If the data is true, then you gain more useful information. If it is false, then you learn something very important. The book lists 3 ways that we can notice changes in media. 1. Content shifts from one format to another. 2. The roles of primary and secondary media production change hands. 3. Practices established in newer forms of media change expectations in older forms. The book discusses all 3 of these. It points out, for example, how much actual content has shifted to new formats. Newspapers and other print media, such as magazines, have seen sales drastically drop, while there are other all-digital magazines and news sources. Even those newspapers and magazines that still use print have a strong online presence. I myself do not subscribe to a physical copy of the New York Times, but I visit their webpage, which is not unusual for them, as the book points out that their digital circulation was twice that of their print circulation. And I believe that this is only counting subscribers, not people who visit for a free article here and there. There are, of course, many advantages to this. If one hears about some breaking news, one doesn't have to wait a day to read about it. News websites are being constantly updated, and this is expected. Indeed, as the book points out, It is often these digital sources that are first to break news. When discussing news in earlier portions of the course, we discussed the Young Turks, for example, how they broke several important news stories. If we look at the graphs provided, we notice that nearly 35% of respondents say that they get news throughout the entire day, while slightly less say that they primarily get it in the evening, and slightly less than that, about 25%, say that they primarily get it in the morning. In another graph, television is still the device most often used for news, but laptops and desktop computers are a close second. Also, tablets and cell phones are separate categories, the later of which is nearly as widely used as newspapers and magazines. What should perhaps be more concerning is this graph, which notes that while most people still say that they get their news directly from news sources, word of mouth, news curation sites, sharing with friends, and other social media all come in close. Search engines are also on this list, but I am not sure why, because search engines give links to other sites. They do not typically provide the news themselves, unless I'm misunderstanding this graph. If that is the case, that probably doesn't tell us much. The last graph shows level of trust based on various news sources. We might notice that news alerts are the most trusted. News organizations come in second, but perhaps disturbing is that social media and word of mouth also rank nearly as highly. Of course, sometimes one does get accurate news by word of mouth or social media, but we tend to trust our friends and people we know. It is therefore all the more important to fact check such sources as much as we are able. In many ways, new media is unlike old media. The book says if Facebook has an analog, it's some combination of personal ad, diary, and self-portrait. For Twitter, it's a bullhorn so low on batteries that only lasts for a minute or two. In other words, it's difficult to draw analogies between some old and new media. The online version of the New York Times is similar to the paper version, but it is updated more often and readers can comment directly on the article and on each other's comments. But what is Facebook like? Maybe it's like a bulletin board where people can walk by and post notes, but those notes can be seen by millions. Those notes are also recommended to people based on their particular interests. One can follow and receive updates about when some particular people post new notes, or one can hide away the notes from those they do not wish to see, and the system itself tries to choose for you what you do and do not wish to see. Another issue not mentioned in the book is a psychological impediment to reasoning that's perhaps getting a larger grip on us with new media. This arises from the fact that people seem to mistake repetition for truth. Perhaps related to this, the so-called backfire effect. This is the psychological tendency for people to strengthen their beliefs in the face of contrary evidence. Several studies, for example, have shown that when anti-vaxxers or people who do not believe in climate change are shown contrary evidence, no matter how strong, they end up believing their original beliefs more strongly. One theory for why this happens is that to debunk a claim, one needs to repeat that claim that is being debunked, and that this reinforces the claim. There are other reasons as well. In a Dartmouth study on this effect, the authors Brendan Nyhan and Jason Ryler say, among other things, that the process by which people counter-argue preference incongruent information and bolster their pre-existing views. If people counter-argue unwelcome information vigorously enough, they may end up with more attitudinally congruent information in mind than before the debate, which in turn leads them to report opinions that are more extreme than they otherwise would have had. The point here is that these worries might be especially poignant with new media because people are bombarded with quicker bits of information and also often with people expressing more extreme views. Under the section The More Things Change, the authors discuss again the debates between Buckley and Vidal, in which Vidal referred to Buckley as a crypto-Nazi and Buckley called Vidal a queer and threatened to attack him. While this shocked the audience, it was good for ratings. With much of online discussion ratings measured by clicks, views, followers, and likes, as well as how often such links are shared, there are plenty of sites that now specialize in what has become known as clickbait. Wikipedia says that clickbait headlines typically aim to exploit the curiosity gap by providing just enough information to make readers curious. There's also what we might call sharebait. These are posts that entreat people to share if they are not heartless or if they sympathize with some position that is generally socially lauded. Share if you love your mother, or share if you hate Nazis, or share if you love God, or share if you think this crime is terrible, and so forth. Such links often bring eyes and money to sketchy people and organizations, even though most people who share the links are unaware of this. But the authors of the book were primarily concerned with ad hominem attacks and trolling, which also pervade the net. The authors say, today there are two places where people become their worst selves, the internet and their cars. It seems that whenever some of us are faced with a situation that is social, yet involves some distance away from face-to-face contact, they forget all civility, sympathy, and generosity. Of course, access to the internet is not universal even within the United States. The book notes that as of 2016, 88% of the US has home internet access, but that worldwide has it at less than 50%. This means that while some of us are empowered by getting access to information faster and faster, others are at risk of being left behind in a technology gap. Another important issue mentioned briefly in the text is net neutrality. Net neutrality is the idea that internet service providers must treat the source of information neutrally, neither speeding up nor slowing down traffic from particular sites. The issue has come to the forefront as Trump's FCC head Ajit Pai is very much against net neutrality. Net neutrality is very popular with the population, though. A poll carried out by Mozilla shows that 76% of Americans support net neutrality, including 74% of Republicans and 81% of Democrats. Plenty of both Democratic and even more Republican politicians, however, are happy to undermine net neutrality. This may be because of genuine convictions, but it is likely due to the fact that they receive such large sums of money from telecommunication companies. It should be noted also that most Americans seem to strongly support net neutrality, even working against the fact that this issue is often not discussed much by mainstream media such as CNN, which is owned by Time Warner, or NBC, which is owned by Comcast, or most other TV and cable news, because these are exactly the companies that stand to benefit from eliminating net neutrality. Other major broadcasters receive large amounts of money from these corporations through advertisements. So one key thing to take away from this class is that when looking for bias, follow the money. To give you an idea of how strongly people feel about this issue, the FCC has received a record of 10 million comments regarding net neutrality. The public has taken a massive interest in this, but public interest often doesn't have the same influence as corporate dollars. In spite of this massive interest, net neutrality might be doomed. This is changing so fast that you should check to see its status right now. It might have changed since I created this video. It should be noted that, as with most topics, I am not claiming that net neutrality is a good or bad thing. You can think about that for yourselves. The point is, however, from a logical perspective, that there are particular biases in the presentation of our data regarding net neutrality, and in spite of these biases working against net neutrality, most people still support it. Net neutrality is not only an issue relevant to this current module, but provides a prime example of the kinds of biases we have been talking about all semester, especially the economic biases mentioned in the news sections of this course. The book also discusses what it calls a shifting balance between our private and public lives. This isn't a straightforward shift in one direction or another. That's because while many things that were once private and once only seen by family and friends, such as vacation pictures or family photos, are now shared with anybody who cares to look. At the same time, we are able to do much more of our shopping privately online. So technology has worked in both ways, though it is important to note that we have almost certainly lost more privacy than we have gained. Of course, even though many people now do a great deal of their shopping online, in some ways we are sacrificing even more privacy in areas like this as well. It may not seem as if somebody is watching you buy items online, but corporations are collecting copious amounts of data about not only what you buy, but all the sites you visit. It just feels more private. In fact, a bill just passed down party lines by Republicans was Senate Joint Resolution 34, HRES 230. The bill allows internet service providers to sell your information without your consent, including all of your past browsing data. It also makes it more difficult to change this rule in the future. You may wish to check out its current status, as some news changes more quickly than I can update these videos. Much as with net neutrality, this is not something that is popular with the voting population, including Republicans, but it is popular enough with certain large corporations. The vote was 231 Republicans for, 189 Democrats against, while a total of 9 Democrats and Republicans simply did not vote. The nature of celebrity has also changed. While at one time, in order to become a celebrity, people had to deal with managers and deliberately enter the entertainment industry, now people can self-publish on YouTube, Twitter, or have a blog post and suddenly become famous. Sometimes people are thrust into fame quite accidentally or unexpectedly, like Joe the Plumber, or Ken Bone, or Jonathan Ware, the I Like Turtles kid. It is also easier for people to become infamous. If a person throws a racist tantrum at Starbucks and is caught on video, they might find their tirade going viral. The CEO who jacked up certain drug prices by 5,000%, Martin Shkreli, found a great deal of internet infamy. And of course, we can hardly turn on the news anymore without hearing about the latest video recording of a police shooting. Heck, now people sometimes even find their pets thrust into fame, such as Grumpy the cat. One of the people who I was friends with when I went to community college myself is now on the rise in internet celebrity with more than 100,000 followers. Likewise, public figures who never had the same expectation of privacy now have less of it. While tabloids have often stalked such celebrities for a while, it is now the case that they are often surprised by recordings in public. My point here isn't to judge whether this is a good or bad thing, but merely to point out the change. There are likely positive and negative aspects to this. The positive being that the voting public now has a better idea of what these public figures are really like, whether it's Auntie Weiner, aka Carlos Danger, the former Democratic congressman, or Eric Bolling from Fox News, both of whom were accused of sending pictures of their privates to women, or people like the Georgian politician Tom Worthen caught making racist comments. Since there's more interest in public figures, they often find things that they have said or did, which would have remained hidden 10 or 15 years ago, now being catapulted into unwanted public scrutiny. This, of course, is just a very small sampling of such cases. If you watch or read the news, you hear about such things nearly daily. The upshot of this is that fame, both intentional and unintentional, now, as the book puts it, bypasses the traditional gatekeepers. Celebrities can speak directly to their millions of followers rather than speak to them through a carefully constructed press release or magazine article. And everyday citizens can likewise find that they have a larger audience than they would have ever suspected possible. Though, as the book points out, there seems to be no science to what kinds of posts will and will not go viral. They may have some elements in common, but of all the millions of communications each day, the ones that hit the right buttons at the right time seem to be random. The book also discusses the Streisand effect. This is the effect of accidentally drawing more attention to something one wants to keep private by trying to hide it. When Barbra Streisand objected to an image that was released of her beachfront home, that itself became the story. A picture with only 10 views suddenly received millions. There's a whole Wikipedia page dedicated to the Streisand effect. This is an often repeated mistake made by politicians, businesses, and individuals alike. Speaking of Wikipedia, you may have noticed that I have used Wikipedia a couple times for this course. Some studies have shown it to be as reliable as encyclopedias such as the Encyclopedia Britannica. But there are worries with Wikipedia because it can be edited by individuals and there are often wars over content of its pages. Wiki tends to keep its quality high in part by insisting on quality sources and citing material, but not all online sources of news are so good. The website IFL Science, I will not say what the F stands for, repeats what are often legitimate science stories but sensationalizes them and takes them out of context. I have lost count of how many times they imply that we finally have proof of alien civilizations. In contrast to Wikipedia, there is also Conservapedia, which means to spin information in a so-called conservative direction. But unlike Wikipedia, it doesn't allow anybody to edit it and doesn't seem to have the same kind of strict control over sources of quality. Some examples of claims that seem to be debunked in the scientific community that are listed in it are claims of a young Earth, claims that abortion leads to breast cancer, claims that global climate change is a hoax, and even that Einstein's theory of relativity is bogus. I could create an entire lecture, heck, an entire class, around untrustworthy sources of information and still not scratch the surface of all of them that are out there. So what can you do about this? We've already mentioned it. Check the sources that your sources use. Do not just check to see if they use sources. Look up those sources. Are they up to date? Are they cited in context? Do they represent the consensus of scientific thought? Eventually you will come to find some sources that are much more trustworthy than others, but it's good to even check the ones that tend to be trustworthy, both to keep them honest and to keep yourself from falling into bias. Bad information can slip into even mainstream news, especially as they struggle more and more to sensationalize their content. And, as I mentioned before, check out the stories that conform to your own worldviews even more carefully than those that run counter to your views. Almost nobody does this, but if you want to give yourself an edge in terms of having an accurate perception of reality, then taking the effort to remain extra vigilant and give extra time to fairly considering the views that run counter to your own is just about the best way to do so that there is. It isn't always comfortable, but it is a way to help combat many of the psychological biases that we all suffer from, which can greatly inhibit our reasoning. If there's one good thing though, and I realize that I am repeating myself here, it is that checking information is easier than ever. Fact checking used to mean a trip to the library and thumbing through card catalogs, often only to discover that the library you are at is too small to have the information you need, or that this information is years old. Now all you have to do is whip out your phone and type a few words into a search engine. So while it is easier to be misled than before in terms of sheer amounts of bad information we are flooded with, there is also less excuse than ever before to remain ignorant regarding any issue. As the book points out, though the media through which we are exposed to arguments has changed, arguments themselves have not. The qualification of what makes a good argument has not changed. Logic is the same. Reason is the same. The criterion for cogent argumentation remains the same. The changes resulting from new media are social, psychological, and rhetorical. New forms of media alter the style and tone of what you were exposed to, and now we have to worry more about echo chambers and bad authorities than ever before, but the criteria of strong argumentation remains the same. And that about wraps it up for this lecture, but make sure that you read all the examples in the chapter and look for examples of the issues we discussed yourself. They are not difficult to find. In summary, technology has been changing the way we communicate, and it has been doing so rapidly. People, both individuals and celebrities, are now able to speak to the public much more easily. The book notes 3 key features of new communication: speed, brevity, and constant change. Other forms of media are now integrating with digital media. For example, even major newspapers like the New York Times see more circulation online than do their print copies. New media sources and modes of communication are constantly appearing. Tone of discourse online is often different than in person, especially when people are able to communicate with anonymity. Even public figures who have the ear of the public use new media to speak directly to their fans and followers. As the book points out, we do not need a new strategy for evaluating arguments. Cogent arguments are still cogent, and uncogent ones are still uncogent. But the book might not emphasize enough how thoroughly we have to be wary of echo chambers that only expose us to one point of view. The biggest danger is that we can't check the strength of an argument or sources of a story, but that we do not. We do not do so for many reasons. This could be laziness or because a friend posted it and we trust that friend. The good news is that it is easier than ever to check such things if one cares about the truth. Fact checking isn't a trip to the library away, it is just a few keystrokes away. And that about wraps it up for this lecture. Until next time.